Hi, welcome to the Paranormal Peep Show, our monthly chat where we explore various topics of the paranormal, everything from fairies, ghosts, spirits, and UFOs. And that's going to be our subject of tonight. We have a special guest talking from the United States. But first, before we get to our guest, I'll say hello to Andy Chaplin. Andy, how are you?
Hello, Neil. Yeah, pretty good. I'm quite happy that we're coming up to Halloween soon, so hopefully Boris won't lock it all down. Cross fingers, really.
Well, hopefully, yeah, and we can all get our masks ready. And I mean, I'm sure there'll be some interesting costumes going around this year to reflect the pandemic, like doctors and jabbing monsters and all sorts of
Yeah,
weird stuff.
and Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Fauci masks. Yeah, that would be cool. I'll definitely bag that one. Excellent. Well, without further ado, I think what we'll do here, we'll dive straight into this one because we've got a special guest. And we don't know how long we've got our special guest before the flying saucers arrive and remove him or anything else, but I'm sure he'll stay around as long as he can. Greetings to Mr. Peter Robbins from the United States. How are you, sir?
Good. And how are you, Neil?
We are fine. I am fine, thank you. Which part of the United States are you at? Just because we were talking about accents earlier on. So, I mean, I'm not very good at pitching American accents. So maybe you could highlight to me where you are, and does your accent match where you are, your location? Are you speaking from the place you were born in other words?
I my accent probably doesn't match because a lot of years of travel and learning that if I use English in non-English speaking countries, I damn well better do it as clearly and distinctly as possible. A fair amount of stage training. I am a New Yorker, born and bred in New York City. I've lived there most of my life in one part of the city or another, but the last years, my home base is in rural central New York, some miles from they call it a city, I would call it a large town called Ithaca, most famous for being a college town, Cornell University, Ithaca College, a beautiful part of New York State, which might surprise people, is overwhelmingly rural, although we're conditioned to think when we hear the word New York City.
Excellent, excellent. So New York is a big place, isn't it? Because it's divided up into all sorts of areas. So would that be north of New York or east, west?
I am about, as the crow flies, probably about 170, 180 miles northwest of New York City, right? Just below center in the state of New York.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So for all those on Google Earth, you can try and
Mhm.
take a look at that now. I'll probably be doing that later on because I'm always looking at maps. So anyway, we are having you here to talk about your career and the books and the research and the presentations that you've done on the theme, the subject of UFOs, aliens and things like that. And I know you wrote the book Left at Eastgate many years ago because I read it in the 1980s, I think, when it first came out. Most of the people that might listen to this show would associate you with the Rendlesham Forest mystery, as it's known here. That's Britain's version of crashed saucers, crashed UFOs, or whatever that may be. How did you actually get into this field of UFOs? So what I mean, because you're an artist as well, aren't you? So it's a kind of an interesting concept. I mean, I know that you work with, was it Bud Hopkins as well, who was also an artist, but he also did regression. But we can talk about Bud later on. But how did you discover this interest in UFOs and things?
Well, first of all, the book Left at Eastgate was actually published in the U.S. and the U.K. in 1997,
Oh, really?
that summer. And I'm proud of the fact that it was a top 10 bestseller in the UK, and will always be very proud of the many hundreds of parts within that almost 500-page book. But after many years, commencing about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, my co-author's account began to really become undone. And ultimately, it was established beyond any doubt that he had created his involvement in the events of December 1980, and in fact is a sociopath, a pathological liar, and a forger. And I bought it to a great degree for a very long time. And when it all exploded around me, my career kind of took a nosedive, not surprisingly. And it took me several years to kind of rebuild my presence in the work, in great part because I took the time to take responsibility for uh, essentially helping to foist this partially fabricated story on the public. In fact, the events of December 1980 in the Rendlesham Forest and in that area constitute a very important UFO related incident, no question about it. And there is a lot of well vetted documentation and many books on it now, although there weren't at the time. We commenced work in the summer of 1987. It took almost 10 years to produce the manuscript. And if one reads it, one has to be aware that threading through a tremendous amount of factual material is an awful lot of unfactual material. And read it more as a cautionary tale and do your best to undo the threads. That stated, I had no interest in the subject of UFOs or aliens as a kid, growing up and coming of age primarily in a village about 30 miles east of Manhattan, except in terms of the fun black and white B science fiction movies that were popular at the time and that I would see with my geeky friends at the Fantasy Theater in Rockville Center, Long Island on a Saturday afternoon. But I had lots of other interests as a kid. However, when I was 14 and my sister Helen was 12, we had a profoundly undeniable daylight sighting of 5 silvery white disc-shaped craft. And Helen never forgot it. And maybe being still on the cusp of childhood instead of full-blown adolescence and run by my hormones, she just accepted it as kind of a wonder. And for me, it was very upsetting. It really challenged everything that I thought I understood and intuited from the adult world. And within a relatively short period of time, I had made myself forget it. How do we do these things? Well, the mind is an extraordinary little machine, and obviously we're all familiar with repressed memory syndrome. It's much more common in much more tragic regulation, trauma, death, abuse, whatever. And it was a full 14 plus years before that memory reemerged, with one exception, which was I came of age in the 60s, and my very first LSD trip, which was back in the 60s, when it was still not considered an illegal drug in America. And it was not manufactured in somebody's basement. It was Sandoz Pharmaceutical, Swiss manufactured. And it was a wonderful, life-changing experience for me.
Was it actually sold in pharmacies at that point in time?
Say again?
Was it actually sold in pharmacies at that point in time, LSD?
Yeah.
It was. Good God, didn't know that.
Yeah,
What do they sell it as? I'm really intrigued. Like what
Medicinal or
medicinal or I mean, what was the purpose of selling it?
I don't I mean, I remember a friend who already had used it, had a source. Again, it was not an illegal substance. And it was in really the halcyon days of the 60s, before it all kind of crashed and burned and became a series of kind of distorted myths and legends.
Yeah.
But the reason I bring it up is because during that long, extraordinary experience, the memory returned in a very distorted way, but it returned. And being a young aspiring artist in university, one of the things I had prepared for was having my drawing and painting materials handy. I thought that I might be using them, and I did for part of the day. And I did a series of watercolors that, in their own whacked out way, were referential to that event. and then stuck them in a portfolio somewhere, came upon that portfolio or those drawings some years later, and was horrified that I can't even explain it, but it was just, if I die and somebody finds these, it's going to be so embarrassing. What will they think? The idea of ridicule was still very much prevalent at the time, and it's only the last few years that ridicule around the subject has diminished to a great degree. But I destroyed them. I destroyed them and put the lid back on, and then again, more than 14 years after the initial event, for a series of reasons that I think I understand now, I guess mostly that I was ready to deal with it on a real level, that memory came roaring back into my head like a freight train. And I was overwhelmed emotionally. I could hardly believe what I knew to be true. And my first thought was, how could anyone forget the most profoundly shocking thing they had ever seen in their life? And it took me a while to pull myself back together. But after I did, I thought things through and realized I had a witness. And my sister, who's also an artist and a poet at the time, and living about a mile north of me, I had a commercial loft in New York City's Chinatown. She lived in the East Village, and at the time was making most of her living. She had a big industrial sewing machine on the fifth floor of a ancient New York tenement, and was making one-of-a-kind leathers for rockers. And I called her. And I was very careful not to just blurt out the memory, but to say, I've remembered something from childhood, and I need to know if your memory matches mine. And what I did was I just set up the event by talking about the time of year, the time of day, the weather, where we were standing. And this, again, without discussing it for all those years, she just cut me off mid-sentence and said, stop, I know what you're talking about. And then proceeded to confirm my memories. Although it wasn't until the next day when after we got off the phone, and I did a painting of what I remembered, but I remembered 5, and she thought it might be 6 objects. And I painted 6, and when I showed it to her the next day, I had my hand over the last one, and then I removed it. And she agreed that it was 5 because we both remembered them coming in at a high rate of speed and being in a V, like Victor formation. And
Peter,
that
I
would,
think at this point, just to interrupt, could we go right the actual incident that you had and what you both saw? Could you go right from the beginning of the circumstances, what you actually saw? Because I think we might have skipped over that a little bit.
I think it's
yeah,
good.
no
Yeah.
problem. We were goofing around on the front lawn of the house, as kids do. It was either late spring, early summer, late to mid morning, clear blue sky. And for anyone that's ever lived in or grown up in a small village as opposed to a town or city, and in a leisurely summer, pre-summer morning, there are times when there is nothing going on and nobody on the streets, nothing coming by, no cars, no children, no nothing. And I caught some movement out of my right peripheral vision and looked up in time to see these 5 silvery white disc-shaped objects, all elliptical, like holding a dinner plate out at a distance, tipped, moving like one thing. And I either yelled, Helen, or look. I know it was one word. And they stopped over the neighbor's house, and there they were. They were not shiny like stainless steel, but they were obviously metallic. And they were close enough. There's, again, nothing ambiguous about this, no cloud cover, nothing. They were close enough that we both made out regular detailing around the edge of each, that many years later, when we finally discussed it, we both agreed we could only read in the same way that you would read windows on a commercial airliner at an appreciable distance. And they just hung there in the sky. And I, many
Approximate
years,
size?
Say again?
Approximate
Ah,
size. Were they big? Were they
approximate
small?
size would be based on how large they were.
Mm,
If they were the size of a small private plane, they were X feet away. If they were as large as a commercial aircraft, they were Y feet away. Um, I don't know. I'm guessing they were substantial in size and, at least 1,000 feet away. I just don't know, but
mm,
there was nothing, again, unclear about them. And the detailing around the edge of each was lighter. Again, my memory and Helen's was just, what else could it be but windows? And I was a happy kid. I had a happy childhood. I know that now more than ever. As you grow older and people tell you about their childhoods, you realize either how lucky or how unlucky you were in yours.
mm,
And it was a much more innocent time. Um, I was a very unsophisticated kid, but I had the best of several worlds. I was growing up in a wonderful village, a block away from a state park, in contact with nature. I was still a Boy Scout, but I was 40 minutes away by train from Midtown Manhattan, where my grandparents lived. And the world of museums and even the theater was opening up to me, and architecture and culture. And this just didn't fit. Um, I have to say that once I became obsessed with the subject several years in and was offered the opportunity to undergo hypnotic regression, I waited until I was ready. I did it 3 times with 3 different people. The first was with an old friend who had just taken a course in hypnosis, knew nothing about UFOs and could care less, just wanted somebody to hypnotize.
guinea pigs.
And nothing really came up out of that. The second one, though, was with one of my first mentors, a tough, no nonsense New York City police detective who had been chosen for special training by the NYPD to use regressive hypnosis in criminal investigation. His name was Pete Mazzola, and he's also a wonderful ufologist. And then the other person was Bud Hopkins, who went on to become my most influential mentor, a friend and close colleague of 35 years, whose assistant I worked as for a good part of the time we were friends. Um, anyway, the 2 hypnotic regressions confirmed what I remembered. And one of the things was I went through a reaction when I saw them that I have gone on to document with more people than I can count over the decades. I I call it the checklist reaction or response, where you look up, living your life, minding your own business, and you see a thing of things in the sky, and your rational mind just clicks off what they are not. Planes, kites, blimps, balloons, helicopters, strange shaped clouds, birds, flotsam and jetsam, reflections from the ground, and then you kind of hit the wall. I know I did. And I experienced a sense of extremely deep loneliness. The way I interpret that as an adult is everything that I thought I knew,
Mm,
and as I said before, or intuited from the adult world around me, was now open to question. All I knew about flying saucers was, they were fun in the movies and, aliens and all that stuff. But I guess I intuited the adult point of view that they were not real and never really gave it another thought, but there they were. Um, so my sister confirms this memory for me and then says, but there's more, and proceeds to tell me the most shocking thing anybody had ever told me in my life up till that moment. This before UFO abduction research was really coming even into its infancy. And a decade or two, at least, before the term gray to describe that ubiquitous type of non-human being,
mm,
and told me about memories of being taken right then and there as I was knocked out, is all I can say, on the front lawn. And my sister, who passed in early 2000, and I were not just siblings, but very close friends. And for part of our life together, we were roommates, um, fellow artists. We edited each other's writing. We'd stay up late, smoking weed and watching bad movies. We dated each other's friends. And my immediate thought was, this is crazy, but I don't get that she's lying to me, even though I had never heard another reference to anything like this in my life. Although a great American debunker some years later said, well, I probably had, seen the special issue of Look or Life magazine, big weeklies at the time, in the mid 60s on Betty and Barney Hill, and confabulated this event in my mind, and so on, and Helen too. But I immediately became obsessed, and I mean immediately in the moment, with what the hell had happened to my sister and what were these things that we had seen, and what were the implications for humanity. I mean, it happened like that. People say my life changed overnight. Mine changed that quickly. And what I resented most was I was very fortunate as a kid. I was very good at one thing, drawing and painting. It was many years till I learned that I suffered from a condition called dyslexia, which now is very understood, and many people have it. All I knew is I was bad in math and good in drawing, and I damn well better develop this because it's where I got my approval in the adult world and I enjoyed it. And early on, I understood, probably from the age of about 5 or 6, that there were grown-ups, this in part because I was already being taken to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Modern Art and Museum of Natural History, that there were grown-ups who didn't do what my dad and so many dads did, go to an office and work at stuff and get the stuff called money and pay for things, that they did what I love doing, which was make drawings and paintings and sell them to other grown-ups. What a racket, right? I knew what I wanted to do early on. And I studied art at university. I transferred to the School of Visual Arts in New York, where I graduated from, joined the faculty, taught painting for many years. But as this thing settled into my reality, I realized that something more important had landed on my doorstep, so to say. And I wasn't playing at being an artist. When this happened, I was already in my 20s. My work was starting to be shown. I had apprenticed to one of the last great abstract expressionists and other artists. I knew Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein and other famous artists. I was working in galleries. I was on my way. I had a shot at it. And all of a sudden, I felt like I was playing at it. And I resented it more than I can say. And I still resent it to a degree. And ultimately, I kept painting and teaching and showing my work, but I knew that the heart had gone out of it and that there was something else I should be doing. And that is the very long answer to your very short question about how I got involved in the work.
Okay, let's get to the meat of it. The experiences that you had and the hypnosis and the hypnotic regression that you had, can you walk us through what you experienced? You said you mentioned you saw the greys. Was there any communication?
No, I mentioned my sister did.
Oh, your
I've
sister.
really not had these kind of experiences. I've worked with hundreds of people that have, and very closely. Um, I'm as knowledgeable as anyone I know on the absolute reality of the subject and the kind of evidence that you could bring into a court of law to back it up. It's certainly not all anecdotal.
So if I'm getting this right, both you and your sister saw the 5 UFOs when you were younger. You were knocked out and you didn't remember. Your sister, was she knocked out or what?
No,
Wasn't
she saw me go down.
right.
And then, as she told me right then and there on the phone, she just lifted off the ground. And two very common threads that run through this, although they sound as loopy as anything associated with the reality of being taken by non-human intelligences. And examined, returned, what have you, is that often in the case where it's a brother and sister, or a husband and wife, or a partner and a partner, whatever, um, they're only interested in one of the individuals,
Mm.
and one is put unconscious, the other one is taken. The other is that this is something that does rarely seems to happen on a random basis as much as follow bloodlines. That if it happened to you, the likelihood is very great that it happened to one of your parents, or both of them may well happen or have happened to your children. I've dealt with, in part through Bud Hopkins and certainly on my own research, um, three generations who are unabashed in confirming their experiences, and never with any intention for gain, be it monetary or wanting to be public people. That's the last thing that they're interested in. Helen's memories, although fragmented, she never forgot. And
Mm.
when I asked her the logical question after she, dropped this atomic bomb on my thinking, was how come, you know, um, we never talked about this for starters? And she said, do you remember later that afternoon, I came up to you and I said, do you want to talk about what we saw? And I said, I do. And she said, you remember what you said? And I said, yes. I said, no. She said, one day led to the next week, next year. I love you and respect you. And it's obvious you weren't comfortable with it. I said, so what have you been thinking all these years? You remember this? She said, yeah, not a day passes really where I don't think of it in passing. And I said, well, how do you feel about that? She said, well, from the time that it happened, I simply told myself that you're special. And that was that. She never felt compelled to share it with, other kids or girlfriends. It was just part of her inner life. But she had clear memories of being walked through, well, first going up.
Mm.
And also, this doesn't make any sense, but it is a profoundly normal part of the profile. All of a sudden, you're going up in the air. And at a certain point, you realize, again, if you're consciously being taken, as opposed to other ways of being taken, that you're high enough that if whatever is happening stops happening, gravity will intercede and you will die.
Yeah.
And she said, it was just wondrous to me. I had no fear at all. I looked down, I saw you lying there getting smaller. I saw the top of our house for the first and last time getting smaller. I looked up, I saw these things getting bigger as I headed toward the bottom of one of them. And the next thing I knew, I'm inside, or
Mhm.
I deduced that, being walked through a curved metal hallway by a bunch of small beings. And again, that word gray didn't exist. And the
Mm.
term she created as a 12-year-old was little doctors with big heads and big black eyes who talked to you in your head, but one taller one that had the same look, but considerably taller, the leader, the one that was talking to her in her head. And the things that she was hearing, if you study the literature, there are hundreds of documented accounts of people hearing the same thing, sometimes word for word.
Mm.
You're special. You've seen us before and you'll see us again, or we've seen you before, or we'll see you again. We love you. We will not hurt you. And the next thing she knows, she is on a metal table, a
Mhm.
very specific metal table, which is always the same table, in descriptions from authentic abductees, with no clothes on, being examined and poked and prodded. And where things went awry for her was at a point where she was hearing, words to the effect of, we love you, we will not hurt you. She was experiencing pain from whatever they were doing.
Mm.
And she never was a fan of theirs. And soon after we we entered this phase of our life together, I don't know whether it was a week or several weeks, but we made a time when we could get together with our folks to have dinner with them and tell them about this. And while they were shocked in their own quiet way, they were never anything less than supportive. Um, and Helen was at the cusp of a major career break. This was coming into the later mid-70s, and the whole new music movement in Lower Manhattan, which had kind of taken off the year before in London, that we now call punk,
Mm.
was emanating out of a number of small clubs within walking distance of where we both lived. And she had become a regular at a little hole in the wall place called CBGB's. And I remember the first time I heard some of this music, and I love so many kinds of music and grew up with classic rock and roll and Motown and soul and heavy metal. Um, but thinking about it now, I have to laugh because my first impression of it was, I sound like my dad. That's just a whole bunch of noise, you know. And she dragged me to CBGB's to see this group who had become friends of hers named the Ramones.
Mm.
And I was sold. And over the next years, she developed a band, became a very highly regarded performer, lyricist, singer, wrote gold and platinum record award winning lyrics for the Blue Oyster Cult. And I got to see and hang out in this tiny little club and cat club and other clubs around the city with the Talking Heads and Iggy and uh, again the Ramones, Blondie,
Mm.
all that first wave. And of course, you had no idea what you were into at the time. The reason I bring it up is because Helen was very outspoken from the start. She would talk to anybody about this and couldn't
Mm.
care less what they thought about it. Used it in certain lyrics. It was something that she never backed down from. We ultimately did a number of television shows together with Bud Hopkins. And she was very much an advocate for and very courageous in being a public person to put a face on this reality
Mm.
for more people than you would be comfortable thinking about.
I think Robbie Williams has got a big telescope in LA, and he's looking out for
That's
UFOs and
right.
things. And
Well, Robbie is very serious about the subject and
mm,
has been for many years.
mm.
Mm, mm.
With your sister, so it's almost like the grey beings, and you mentioned that there's like a similar pattern. It's almost like a software program running, like,
Yes.
and a lot of people kind of describe them as quite robotic and not really kind of biological, more kind of plant-like or robotic-like. And it's almost like it reminds me of Mars Attacks, you know, which is a very funny film. But there's kind of they're landing and they're going, you know, peace, you know, we are here, blah 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 blah, and all this. And as they're telling you that they want peace, they're shooting at you with all these pistols, and it's just
Oh,
so bizarre. It's
my
just so.
favorite bad aliens. It's interesting you describe it like that. At one point, when I asked Helen what it was like in terms of how you would describe the experience, she, again, this is before this, years before this had become a major subject, even in UFO studies. And she said, I think word for word, it was like being in a well-run dentist's office. Um, we can only theorize about this. If people
Mm.
tell you that they know for a fact this, that, and the other thing about these other intelligences, I would take it with a grain of salt or an entire salt shaker. I know a good deal about this subject. It's been something I've been deeply involved in for more than 40 years of study. But I also know how little I really know, as opposed to what I deduce, I feel, I think may be the case, like that. And I do parse those things, and occasionally it drives people a little crazy. But you're an expert, you know, how come you just don't, you know, say what it is? Say first, it's a word I'm very uncomfortable with and kind of an existential joke for me. I'm an expert in the unknown. Let's think about that one for a bit.
Mm.
Um, I know more than most people, but number one, I think it's fair to say that out there in the cosmos and other dimensions, however we want to see it, mixture of both, they're teeming with life.
Mm.
It's not like we're here on the earth as this, what we'll laughingly call an evolved life form, and one other evolved life form in all of the cosmos has found us and they're interacting with us in this covert way, as opposed to there's probably a myriad of other intelligences coming and going with various thoughts and relationships with humanity. We may be somebody's graduate experiment gone horribly wrong. Um, you know, whatever you think might be the case might be the case. And there is this one group, certainly, who we refer to as grays, who do seem more in their behavior like worker bees or ants. Emotion doesn't enter into their behavior. They are observers, and they have their own agenda. They're doing what they're doing for their own reasons or the reasons of those other intelligences who control them.
Mm.
And, you know, asking questions such as, are they good or are they bad, really are the wrong questions to ask. I sometimes think the best way to look at the situation is, let's say the three of us, our lives had evolved differently, and we had become mammalian biologists, and our specialty was some kind of rare otter or otters. What a great animal they are. And there was an endangered species that lived way up in northern Canada, and the three of us were airdropped in there with all our scientific supplies and food and tents and things for 2 weeks to capture and study, etc. And we had these no harm traps, and we catch our first otter, and we're there. Andrew's taking notes. Neil, you're reaching into the cage. I prepared a syringe with some kind of, you know, vaccine to make sure this otter doesn't get any otter diseases. And we love these creatures. We're fascinated by them. We're devoting our lives to studying them. You're petting it and saying, you know, we won't hurt you. We love you. You're making your notes.
Mm.
But at the same time, I'm injecting it, fitting it with a radio collar.
Mm.
It's effing freaking out.
Mm.
And, you know, wanders dizzily back to Otterland, saying, you're never going to believe what happened to me. And they say, no. And what the hell is that on your side and around your neck?
Mm.
Doesn't have to do with bad or good. They're doing what they're doing for a reason. And that's just one group of them. And this is not science fiction. This is science fact.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
And
What
and
strike?
I was
Go
going
on,
to add to
Andy.
that. I was going to add to that. There seems to be a consistent pattern that I've noticed that the humans that get abducted and then freak out are either subdued or they only remember the bad experiences. But interestingly, when you get people who have been abducted and they kind of like a bit more relaxed about it and want to communicate, then some kind of communication starts to happen. And then sometimes they're actually allowed to get up and wander around the spaceship and ask questions. I don't know if you've come across that, Peter.
Oh, yes. Um, the fact is, what is happening to any individual is certainly in part informed by everything they have brought with them in their life to that moment. If they are open, um, basically emotionally secure people who are open-minded and trusting, um, that will inform their experience. If they are anxiety prone, have had rough lives, um, tend to, you know, see things in terms of demons and spirits and, you know, bad and good and the devil and God or what have you, they are set up in a certain level internally to experience something differently. That aside, we have many, many what I would consider righteously confirmed events going back decades in terms of the responsible research community, where many people report very positive experiences, beatific, if you will, ones that they grow from, that they expand. UFOs and consciousness are now more and more studied, you know, as parallel experiences, where many other people report traumatic experiences. Again, I don't think we can ascribe that to good and bad. Um, it's just the nature of the beast. Um, Bud Hopkins, for example, who was the best self-trained investigative researcher I ever knew. He was remarkable. I would sometimes joke with him that if he had gone into New York law enforcement instead of abduction research, God help the criminal element in New York City. He began out of intense curiosity based on an incident that happened about the same time, give or take, that Helen and I had this profound conversation after my memory of that day returned. A local merchant who shared with him a remarkable UFO incident that had happened to him. And a tough, no nonsense World War II veteran who owned a local store, you know, Catholic widower, a certain American profile, not prone to fantasy thinking. But Bud was so fascinated by it that he basically researched the whole thing, found witnesses, physical evidence, published it. It was his first article. Came out less than a year after my obsession began. I read it in local paper, cold called him on the phone, and we got together for our first sit down, had coffee, and this was 5 years before he published his first UFO book. We were connecting as two guys who were New York painters who were recently quite fascinated by the subject. He was more fascinated by Helen's experience than by the sighting, and they became good friends over the years. She worked with him as part of one of his first support groups for people that had these experiences as well.
Wow.
Neil, you wanted to ask something?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things come to mind there is that when Helen was taken aboard and she said she was laid upon this metal table. And it's one of these things you don't really think about, and unless you sort of think, well, hang on, these craft, these UFO, flying saucers, whatever you want to call them, essentially from all the descriptions that come forward, especially when people are taken aboard, once they're inside the things, is that it seem to be flying laboratories, where they're, like you said, a dentist's office. She described it as a really efficiently run dentist's office, and a dentist's office there is designed for one thing. It's not a home, it's not a house, it's a surgical room to do dentistry on people's teeth. It's there for a purpose. And although these craft can fly, that's merely the way that they're going to get from somewhere to somewhere else. But the purpose of them appears to be that they've got that metal desk in there that they want to put people on. They want to
Well,
slap people. And just think about the number of people prior to Helen that must have been put on that very same table, that maybe have remembered it or not, or they could have even been regressed by Bud or other people. The very
we have
same UFO.
It must be literally a scientific ship with a scientific
Yeah.
purpose. That must be it.
there are, I would say conservatively, and you're looking at a small portion of my library around these studies behind me, where most of the books you see are regarding this general subject. Um, we have thousands of credible accounts, and those are the people that have been willing to come forward or been able to find somebody to seek out. I think the majority of people that have experiences like this, uh, captured in a title of a book by a specialty researcher, Dr. David Jacobs, this is their secret life. That they, even now in a time of decreasing ridicule, that they live to a degree in fear of people finding out about, because they feel they'll be, singled out or made fun of, or any of the normal human reactions you might have, or live in an area where there's just nobody accessible. Um, here's a thought though. A colleague once said to me, and again, when we're talking about this kind of craft with this kind of room, it's one of probably quite, like airplanes. There's a lot of different kinds of them. And we have reports going back time immemorial to various different kinds of alleged craft. I did a broadcast last night regarding religion and UFOs with a minister, two lay Catholic scholars, a rabbi, And we began to really scratch the surface. But the second half, with an art background and collecting different kinds of evidence over the years, we looked at a number of artistic renditions, paintings, frescoes, going back to an Anglo-Saxon series of representations from 776. But most of the paintings centered 14th, 15th century of things that damn well looked like modern photographs or representations of what we will call UFOs as actual machines.
Yeah.
But again, it's funny how just phrasing something a certain way can be quite life-changing. And what this colleague said to me, I want you to remember or think about that somewhere out there on some planet, moon, asteroid, there is a factory that has a division or an assembly line or what have you that manufactures those tables. And it really kind of knocked me off my beam for a moment because it was so logical and so hyper specific. Also, I will say that in the many, many accounts that I've been privy to, that I am sure as I can be are authentic, there are details about the table that are always the same, that to the best of my knowledge have never been published. So there's something to reflect on there.
Out of
Interesting.
interest, Peter, have you come across any people that have described, Star Wars, the Jawas, what the Jawas look like? The little hooded beings
In the first
um,
Star Wars film,
in the first Star Wars.
on Tatooine, the
Yeah,
robot collectors.
and you got the little Jawas. I think I had an incident when I was younger where I saw similar beings, but without the glowing eyes. So in Star Wars, they've got yellow LED glowing eyes. Whereas I kind of remember calling them the troll figures, but I don't remember seeing their faces. Have you come across that at all?
To a degree, in terms of hooded figures per se. Let's also remember here that from my point of view as a deeply embedded researcher, we're not just dealing with intelligences that can appear or disappear, but who very definitely seem to have the ability to control our perceptions to a degree. And a friend and colleague, Mike Cleland, wonderful guy who is an experiencer and abductee who worked with Bud Hopkins, who has gone on to become a very respected author of several books on the subject, began to pick up some years ago that, like himself, the image of owls seems somewhat prevalent, peripherally or directly, in the accounts and memories of people who have these experiences. And I remember the first time I encountered it when I was working with Bud, of a maybe 4-foot white owl or 3.5-foot white owl allegedly sitting on the windowsill of an experiencer's room. And no, it probably wasn't a white owl, oversized, sitting there. The question for me, unlike some of my colleagues, is not just, is that what they put in your mind? A a false memory, because you could tolerate that and not totally freak out seeing what was really there, which would be even more challenging? Or is that a function of our minds dealing with the shock and creating its own alternate image, which is not uncommon in conventional trauma, if that's not an oxymoron, where we can't handle what we're seeing or what's happening. So we create, again, the term would be screen memory in their case, on our own. Or is it them, or sometimes a combination of both? It's a tangential question, but one worth asking. But yes, again, hooded beings, yes. And whether or not they were actually hooded or they created the hooding, or we created the hooding are the questions to look at.
Hmm.
Mm.
It could be that because Star Wars was 1977 and you were young, what, 1980 or
I
something?
know
Would
we're
this
going to
be?
go with this, Neil. I would have watched Star Wars and then created it. No, it was the other way around.
No, okay.
I had these beings. God knows what age I was, maybe 3, 4 as a guess. Then I watched Star Wars later on, and it was when I was watching Star Wars that the hair started going at the back of my neck.
Mm,
So I know most people would say, "Oh, you just watched Star Wars and then created
yeah.
that." No, it's the other way around. I had
Hmm.
this experience, then I watched Star Wars, and I thought, "Holy shit, those things look exactly like what I saw,
Yeah.
minus the
Well,
yellow."
you have both brought up an extremely important subject here, which is that understandably, many people who are good people, open-minded enough, um, with good hearts and not um, intellectually closed off to possibilities of life in other places coming here, the fact is, understandably, are challenged by accounts like we're talking about to the point where it's really a lot easier and a lot more comfortable to say, this is fascinating, but surely there's something else to account for it.
Mm.
And over the years, I've seen cobbled together from the scientific community, among other places. Well, surely this is some strange psychological aberration that we can establish combined with this phenomena called sleep paralysis, combined with the memory that you had from that science fiction movie you saw when you were 8 years old. Well, bullshit. Although that's not out of the question in some cases. Again, for debunkers, and let's separate debunkers from skeptics. Um, I love the English language. I'm I love reading. I love movies. I'm a movie maniac, but I love the printed word. I'm a bibliophile, not surprisingly, and I'm always reading. I still read Dickens. I occasionally still read Shakespeare. I am a total geek, and the origin of words fascinates me. In my grandfather's time, there was a phrase in America to describe, that's a whole bunch of horseshit. That's a lot of bunk.
Mm.
And I think I remember him as a small child using that phrase laughingly about something that was nonsense. But I don't think it was until the early 1950s that the word debunk appeared in print. If anybody out there is a word geek like me, please tell me if you have an earlier reference to this. In a now very famous declassified American CIA report called the Robertson Panel Report, where for 4 days in February of 52, advisors, consultants, including a then CIA asset named J. Allen Hynek, a very famous uh, astronomer in charge of astronomy studies at Northwestern University, a very fine school in Illinois, here in America, um, who was a shill for the government and created the term swamp gas. And then in 1970, 71 had a very definite turn of heart and became our leading distinguished UFO researcher until his death. In fact, he became so known and so identified with the subject that he plays himself in a cameo role at the end of Close Encounters of the
Hmm.
Third Kind. You'll see him because he's the real
Yeah.
professorly looking guy with a goatee and glasses and a pipe. Anyway, the word debunk was first used there as a form of education, of explaining away. And for debunkers, as Bud used to joke, we should really be in awe of these people. They are so smart that they know this isn't happening. I mean, we're just feeling our way around in the dark trying to figure out what is happening, but they know it's not true. And you might say their mantra is it can't be, therefore it isn't, therefore it's something else. Therefore, let me pat you on the head and explain it away in terms of pseudoscience and insulting, dismissive possibilities. Um, but it is dangerous. And as part of the whole power of ridicule that kept this subject as a complete outsider topic, with even very powerful people not wanting to get too associated with it because who likes to be made fun of? And if you're a scientist or a politician, this could destroy your career for many years if you took it too seriously in a public realm, and did destroy a number of careers. But again, this is very important that, yes, of course, the mind can be influenced by certain things, and there probably are people who, saw a very impacting movie when they were 3 years old, then read a book, then saw a documentary and said, I wonder if that happened to me. And it didn't. Where other people may have a similar profile to an outsider, but then there were the bedroom visitations, a very common phenomena with people who have these experiences. And if you have one in memory, the likelihood is that you have others that you have fragments of, or free-floating anxieties around, that are there, and can be confirmed if you have a desire to do it, either with, and I stress here, a very responsible, empathetic, well-trained, experienced, either mental health professional or somebody who has trained and qualified in a strictly scientific approach to regressive hypnosis, with a background in this very complex area of UFO studies.
Mm.
So there's a whole bunch of stuff going on at one time. And for me, I used to get very angry with people who would simply, brush it away as a nonsensical possibility before I began to really think about what was driving it, which is understandable human anxiety. I mean, again, that feeling I had as a 14-year-old, if this is happening, and for me, it was just simply seeing these impossible objects in the sky, um, then everything I thought I knew is now open to question.
Mm.
Better to just make these people sound like freaks, deny it's a possibility, mm, join the world of people that reject this silly science fiction thinking, than challenge myself to such a degree that the foundations of my reality start to tremble a bit.
Mm.
Hmm. How do you think that people now the world is changing obviously rapidly, and one of your talks presentations covered the fact that you've mentioned there were products in the world where they're kind of like suggesting of aliens and UFOs and things, like sweets, films, toys, things like that. Do you? I mean, obviously, I didn't hear the talk, but by the sounds of it, it sounds like you're suggesting that society or something behind society with these products with alien themed. I mean, for instance, in this country, we got Space Invader crisps or something,
Of
that kind
course.
of stuff.
Yeah,
And there's little flying saucer sweets I saw today in the
that's right.
shop. Um, do you think there's a concerted effort for us to be exposed to this kind of stuff, to kind of, I don't know, familiarize it so we're not wetting the
Yeah.
bed so much at night?
Great question, Neil. You're referring to a project I assigned myself years ago that I've recently updated to a newer presentation. And what it was doing this work and also having a background in the arts. I would occasionally come upon advertisements, originally all in print and then some on television, that used alien or UFO imagery in trying to sell us products, um, or in their packaging. Um, I spent a good part of the summer of 1997 traveling around the UK, because by chance, um, June was the month that Left at Eastgate was published in the UK, early June. And June of 97 was the 50th anniversary of Roswell, and the Kenneth Arnold sightings a week or so earlier in Washington State, a private pilot observing these unusual craft that kicks off the so-called modern age of UFOs. And as you may remember, the UK, in terms of advertising, special glossy magazines, documentaries on television, like the US, went kind of UFO crazy that summer. And I remember picking up, limited edition alien Chews It candy, and keeping the wrappers and all that stuff. What I assigned myself was a project where the premise was is this history of advertising, and I took it well back into the 1970s, um, should we deduce from this that there's some kind of gentle fix in, so to say, where elements within the intelligence community connected up with Madison Avenue, as we would say here in the States, where so many advertising agencies are located in New York City, have been gently indoctrinating us into seeing these images more, accepting subliminally more, or is it simply a matter that when you throw an alien and a flying saucer into an adverb, whether it's for some local mom and pop, ice cream company or some major multinational corporation selling highly technological services or products, that people stop, whether or not they take the subject seriously or they think it's a joke, they'll stop. And, they'll think their thoughts and you've got them for a moment. It's like in the old days of LPs when, we were kids and it was records, not downloads and streaming or, even DVDs or whatever. And you'd be in a record shop. And of course, the art of record jackets was something else again. And now, thankfully, I'm very pleased that we are in a renaissance of people who are, realizing vinyl, is something else again and has its own more authentic sound, warmer, fuller, and, buying used records and looking at turntables again. But for me, again, as an artist, as a member of the counterculture, as a participant in popular culture, and as a lover of music, record jackets. If you got a zillion of them in a record store, if they could get you to stop at one because the art was so interesting, bang, they had a better chance of you buying that record than not. Anyway, I collected dozens and dozens of advertisements over the years. When I'd see a magazine, with an ad, that I just pull it out and put it in a file that I had. But before I really got cracking on it, I contacted colleagues out of the country and around the country to find out if they were doing the same thing. And most of them said yes. And I said, can you make me copies of your files of this? And at the time, especially a number of friends in the UK responded. And then I put together this presentation looking at these advertisements, some that appeared in, a local weekly newspaper or a major international publication, even put together some clips from television advertisements, and ultimately came to my own conclusions about them. And, if I'm ever asked to give this presentation in the UK, I hope this doesn't ruin it for you. But I came away feeling that one way or another, every single advertiser using this imagery that I saw, even if it was embedded in abduction, back engineering, crashed UFOs, all areas of study in the field, that it was still, yeah, UFOs are real in selling you ice cream and computers and insurance, but in reality, real, we could care less. We're a company and an advertising agency trying to make money. So I may be wrong. But it does seem like a very natural series of icons to get people to stop and look and, oh, what is this? Do we have car insurance? Yeah, right, we do. Is this a better deal? But they got you to stop. That's again my opinion only.
There's another kind of bolt-on aspect of this. I don't know if you've noticed, and this was pointed out to me, and once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. Cartoon characters and kind of like some dolls and things like that are beginning to get kind of shorter, with very small chins, with very large heads and very almond-shaped eyes. There's no specific cartoon character I can think of, but I've been shown examples of it. So if you think along the lines of kind of like Japanese manga type cartoons, and
Yes.
even in the US and certainly the UK, it does seem to be this kind of like this almost grey type being that's actually manifested itself, but it looks human because it's got human colorations of skin with
Hybrid.
ponytails. Yeah, well, this is it. What might be going on is acclimatizing people, and especially kids, to the idea of a hybridization or a hybridized ET coming in and kind of merging with humans, so that, let's say, 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the line, if it did actually happen and we start getting greys actually appearing, or humans that look like greys,
Yeah, well,
then we're kind of like, oh yeah, well, okay, yeah, we saw that as a cartoon as we were younger, so there's that aspect as well.
that wouldn't surprise me. The question there, I guess, in the bigger picture is that transition in terms of these characterizations being driven by hip toy designers
Mm,
who know that, UFO and alien imagery has so deeply embedded itself in popular culture over the decades, going
mm,
back to the 1950s and earlier, um,
Mm.
that it's just a trend. Every kid, I'm sure, if you ask any child in the UK or the US at random, do you believe that there are, other, call it what you will? I've never felt really comfortable with the word alien, but let's use it. Um, Aliens and spaceships coming and visiting us here? Of course
mm,
they're going to say yes.
Mm.
Um, I remember years ago talking to my niece and nephew, who I remain very close to, when they were probably in their teens, because, Uncle Peter does this crazy stuff. And my house is shockingly free of all of this stuff. Got some imagery here in the study, but not much. I collect real art, and from Japanese prints or ancient sculptures. That's been my vice since I was young, and where most of my spare money has gone over the decades. But their feeling was, of course, we believe to take it, it's real, and the government covers it up. But you have to understand, we're focused on our day-to-day concerns and our dreams for the future, in terms of environmental degradation, and will there be social security by the time we need it, and can we get, now it all seems a little innocent compared to the increased madness that we're all caught up in at this crazy moment in history.
Mm.
But yeah, it's, we're just not obsessed like you and, Aunt Helen are about the subject.
You're listening to the Paranormal Peep Show. Join us in a minute with more of Peter Robbins.
Today's the best day of my life! Woohoo! Listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network.
Hi folks, welcome back to the Paranormal Peep Show with myself, Andy Chaplin, Neil Geddes Ward and Peter Robbins. Now, before the break, we were talking about, or I was talking about, this concept and notion of the grey physiology, and not the colour grey, but kind of like the species, the alien grey, kind of merging with cartoon characters. Now, we might have, and I actually found some. I literally went onto Google. We might have some copyright issues actually displaying these. So what I'll do, I'll describe what I did, and people can find them, because if we put them on screen, we might get all kind of copyright issues. So what I did is I went onto Google. I literally searched for cartoon character and did a search. And then if you click images, you'll see hundreds and hundreds of different cartoon characters. You'll get the usual. You'll get the Mickey Mouse, the Bart Simpson, you get the Peppa Pig, Pokemon, and all that kind of thing. But if you start to scroll down, you'll begin to find some rather interesting ones. You'll begin to find some, what I could best describe as, and they do seem to be mostly female girl images that follow a certain kind of trend. I'm haven't got kids, so I don't know modern female characters or cartoon characters. I'm completely out of the loop with cartoons. It was, for me, it was Tom and Jerry, and I know those are kind of created in the 1960s, but it's what I used to watch in the 1980s. So I have no idea who these ones are, but I do not know that they're fairly well known. But you will notice that with a lot of the female characters, they've got quite big heads that come down to a very pointed, small chin. They've got small little mouths. They've got small noses, and they've got these big almond-shaped eyes. And it's not just one or two. I found dozens of these. Now, on the one hand, a skeptic could be arguing, maybe I'm looking too deeply into it. Maybe that's just the style, because different decades have different styles. But it is interesting, as Peter was saying before the break, that there's this kind of popular culture in advertising and even pop music and things like that, where the alien brand or the alien theme is running through. And certainly in the movie industry, we've got tons of things to do with aliens and UFOs and that kind of thing. But if you have a look at the cartoons that kids are watching, and don't forget, kids are basically sponges for information and imagery. I don't know. What do you think, Peter? Looking at these cartoons, am I over analysing it, or do they look a little bit grey hybridish to you?
Yeah, I was saying before we went back on the air that for 6 years I worked for a company in Midtown Manhattan called Central Park Media. This in starting the late 90s into about 2004. And they were one of the pioneering companies that brought over and popularized anime and manga culture, so prevalent in Japan among adults and children. And to this day, a mainstay of popular culture there, and now in the US and the UK and other countries as well. I was there because the CEOs of the company took the subject of UFOs and UFO cover-up very seriously, had read some of my writing over the years, and set me up with a company within their corporation. And for 5.5 years, I ran a UFO information website 5 days a week called UFOcity.com. Quite cutting edge for its time. But I was surrounded by professionals working with this imagery. And certainly from the get-go, in Japanese popular culture, these cartoon beings featured very large exaggerated eyes and extremely, simplified faces that have seemed to have evolved to a degree with some of these characters, certainly the ones you pointed out, with the very tiny mouths and the more pointy chins, somewhat reminiscent of a stylized gray per se. I'm not even sure if they're where they're doing it.
This is it. This is it.
But they may well be, because certainly if you're working in that industry, you are aware of popular culture images from other cultures. And to cut to a more serious point, one of the most perplexing, complex, intimidating, anxiety-provoking realities that we have established in this area of UFO studies is that it does seem that part of the intention of these other intelligences and part of what goes on in these examinations and procedures is the intent to produce, and in fact, there are beings that are part them and part us. One can speculate on why they're doing this. It may well be that they can see and have been able to see longer than we have the quickly deteriorating, if you want to call it that, results or future results of the dramatic climactic changes that are accelerating now around the world, and that there may come a time relatively quickly in terms of the great span of time, not the way that we look at it, where 50, 100 years or longer from now, the way that we are will be problematic for survival on this planet in terms of climate change, and that for whatever reasons otherwise they are intent on producing beings that may be more resilient or more to their liking. I can only make guesses there, but it is happening. And we do have a number of chillingly documented cases of beings who very much seem to be part us, part them. And that is part of the reality of this area of study in this very challenging subject.
Mm.
In terms of whether they realize they're doing it or not, the cartoon animators, I kind of wonder whether there's some kind of ET presence that is overlaying or kind of influencing in some way their minds. You know, when we talk about creative imagination, we don't know where it comes from. What if something intercepts that creative space and inserts its own little ideas?
Well, you bring up a very interesting possibility, Andrew. And for me, nothing is out of the question here.
Yeah.
It's all Pandora's boxes, and you lift the lid, and there's another 100 lids there. This entire phenomena is filled with far more questions than answers. But certainly, we have documented as well as we can that their influence can be profound and prevalent, and their ability to affect what we see, what we think, what we feel is not out of the question.
Mm. One of the things that's just occurred to me is that obviously as a graphic artist creating a cartoon character, especially with the fact that you have to animate these things, you don't want your character to be too complicated looking. So everything on their versions of the humans are simplified. So they just do a little, I mean, a classic thing, especially with Disney, they'd always do the hands just with 3 fingers. They would not put any more than that on, just because it was quick to draw, animate it, move it. They weren't really bothered about the fingers too much. But if they had too many fingers to draw, it's just a waste of time. And
Well,
people came to accept it, didn't they?
You're talking about the cartoons I grew up with in part, and also,
Yes.
Tom and Jerry, and
Exactly. The Tom and Jerry,
Rocky
the
and
3-fingered.
Bullwinkle, and
Yeah.
wonderful, endearing American character types. But by the same token, that was part of what came out of analog, old-fashioned, create an image on acetate, a background, then create another image and do thousands and thousands of images, and then cycle through them and create the illusion of the animation. Several years ago, a remarkable film came out. You may have seen it or not. I think it was called We Love You, Vincent, or something like that. And it was drawn from the talent of about 200 animators across Europe, and I think focused in wonderfully skilled animators in Central Europe, that was created in that old-fashioned method, but all with reference to imagery and characters from Vincent van Gogh's paintings. And it wasn't perfect, but it was amazing. And I thought very heroic and very original in terms of what they were doing. Again, now with CGI and computer-aided techniques, you can create very sophisticated, complex cartoon imagery that mimics in every possible way the way that people really move and the nuances of their behavior and facial expressions, etc. So one need not deal with dropping a finger to save time.
Yeah. It's not
It's
so
apples and
laborious
oranges.
because
It's two different realities.
helping you. That's
I could show you like a contrast, Neil. So for instance, I'm going to drop in an image of the original Snow White from Disney. So it should load up in the chat box. It might be a big image actually, which is why it might be taking some time. But for anyone who's kind of like on Google and wants to kind of compare things, have a look at Snow White, the original, not some of the recent ones, but the original whenever it was. I don't know when it was, 40s, 50s,
46 or something like that.
quite long ago.
Let
So
me add that when you look at that image or images from that original film, remember that film was created, I believe, in 1937 and was the very first feature-length movie released fully animated cartoon. Up until then, they'd be a few minutes going back to the 1920s primarily, when the Mickey Mouse character first emerged, et cetera, from Disney Studios. And they were black and white and wonderfully simple and very goofy and, highly, highly stylized. But Snow White changed the game. And for little kids of my generation, it was shocking and an epiphany to see it in films. And then you go on to other great animations like Bambi, which for a lot of us little kids of my generation was our introduction to death. Outside of seeing a dead bird or stepping on a bug or something like that, when Bambi loses his mother in a forest fire, it was very emotional. And again, in a much simpler time, like now, listening to the American 1938 radio play by Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater of the Air that was broadcast on January 30th, the night before Halloween, I think on NBC Radio in New York, and caused a panic among certain people in the population. It was, again, right at that moment, within a week or a few weeks of the start of Germany's invasion of Poland and the beginning of World War II, and people were on edge. But it was brilliantly transposed from the H.G. Wells turn of the century novel to an American location by a great screenwriter, who was also a great radio script writer, named Howard Fass, and still very much worth listening to, also in thinking about the fact that when the whole UFO thing broke open in 1947, one of the genuine understandable concerns of the American government was the possibility of mass panic if it was understood that some of this UFO phenomena was what it probably was in no uncertain terms, which was advanced technology under intelligent control by beings from undetermined origins coming and going with impunity.
So
Yeah.
going back to can you guys see that Snow White?
Yeah, I can
image?
see Snow White. Yeah.
So you'll notice that Snow White back then in the 1940s or whenever it was looks pretty human. It's quite simplistic in terms of like its style, but it looks pretty human. And then if you go up and you see this Disney character called, and it looks like first Latina princess in 2021, Princess Eleanor, I think it is, if I'm getting that right, Princess Eleanor. And you'll notice a very distinct style. Now, of course, it's not going to be the same style as the 1940s. Of course, cartoons are going to evolve. But doesn't the old Snow White look like a human in cartoon form? And
Oh, yes.
And doesn't
and I would say I know that Disney controls its classic projects to a great degree, and probably the only way you can watch the feature-length 1937 fully animated cartoon is by getting at least a temporary subscription to the Disney Channel or something, which may be pretty pricey. But as a cultural artifact, it's brilliant and it's amazing. And if you suspend your sophisticated take on culture, because we've all, I mean, especially since like Jurassic Park and things, anything can be created as an illusion that is indecipherable from reality. But this was a breakthrough, and it's an extraordinary story, well told. And for anybody that really does love popular culture and animation, you owe it to yourself to watch it or Bambi or Dumbo or any of the early Disney classic feature-length animations. And remember, you had several hundred people working for months and months and months, creating thousands upon thousands of cells based on studies of human movement. There are wonderful stills of, a beautiful young actress dressed in that costume, moving across the studio and being filmed, and then frame by frame, animators working with those actual frames, creating those cells on acetate against set beautiful, rendered backgrounds that would then shift to create this phenomena that now, you can do with a computer. And
but the point I'm trying to make on the alien and the UFO side is, if you have a look and compare the Snow White versus the Princess Eleanor, Snow White looks like a human in cartoon form. Princess Eleanor looks like a grey hybrid to me.
Yeah, and again, tastes change, and this is again heavily influenced by the tremendous influence
Mm.
that Japanese popular culture has had on Western animations
Yeah.
and fantasies and cartoons, and now, things, these huge, massive conferences and words that now are part of the lexicon that never used to exist in terms of cosplay,
Yeah,
a
Comic
hybrid
Con.
word, that people, young people especially, segments are now so devoted to and obsessed with.
Mm.
Mm. What intrigued me about this discussion is the fact that you got these characters with the pointed chin, the big eyes, and all that kind of stuff. Are the Greys, because they've obviously drawn them to be simplified images of humans, are the Greys designed to be simplified versions of humans? So in a sense, the Greys are almost like Disneyfied versions of themselves, with 3 fingers, 4 fingers maybe, pointy chins, big eyes, because to create a really complex biological creature, robot, whatever you want, like a human maybe, there's maybe a lot more going on in us than maybe in the Greys, because we're bigger creatures. We haven't got the big eyes. We've got the eyes are in sockets and things, and maybe biologically speaking, that if they are created and they're biological robots, they're just created with the bare minimum of things just to kind of maneuver with, to operate.
Well, the term that was first employed, as I understand it, going back to 1947 or so, for these beings associated with the ones recovered at the Roswell crash, were extraterrestrial biological entities, or EBs. Um, whatever intelligence created them, number one, I think it's fair to assume they were not born in the conventional way from mommy and daddy Greys. These are laboratory created beings. And of course, we are now tapping into this level of biological manipulation ourselves. But whichever intelligence created them to either do their bidding, or however you want to see it, probably set about to do it in a manner that was the most practical and create a biped that could sense and interact and have kind of I believe, a hive mentality, um, to get the job done, as opposed to, some floating bit of protoplasm that, might have life but wasn't practical for the applications and the tasks that they wanted fulfilled. Again, we're in very theoretical grounds here, and
Mm.
I would never presume to say yes or no. Um,
Mm.
for me, what it comes down to is, no matter how many assets or um, different kinds of technology one has at hand as an investigator in this area, if you had millions of pounds, and a laboratory and a wonderful team of highly trained professionals to do your work and try to establish a greater knowledge of what we're talking about here, your best tools are still going to be your critical thinking, your deductive reasoning, and your common sense. As a kid, I was introduced to Arthur Conan Doyle's wonderful Sherlock Holmes character through the great late 30s, early 40s Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce films that we all love and have seen many times, although a lot of wonderful actors prior to and since have given the Holmes and Watson characters new spins and done justice to them. Our public television many years ago started carrying, I guess it was either BBC or a related, first-rate studio in the UK, Jeremy Brett's
Mm-hmm.
wonderful Sherlock Holmes. He's one of my favorites. But that got me at the age of 12 to start reading the books. And one of the things I always admired about Conan Doyle's creating this remarkable character, and having paid my respects at 221B Baker Street upstairs, and loving the Holmes character still, is deductive reasoning. And I've always tried to approach any new investigation or line of thinking, not simply by assuming that because my years in this field, decades, have put me at a point where I consider myself no longer having the luxury of disbelief. I know I'm dealing with a real phenomena here, but that can be dangerous. And it's a trap that you can fall into of saying, another authentic UFO case, and let's charge on and look at it as that, as opposed to beginning by examining it from all angles possible as the most mundane explanation for the phenomena that you feel you're encountering. And if nothing comes up there, still not jumping to a final conclusion, but taking one step up to the second most mundane possibility, and so on. It's time consuming. It can be boring. It's not at all sexy or exotic. But if you go through those steps and you don't find the answers to your questions, then it gets really interesting. And in ufology, which is kind of a damn term these days because there are so many goofballs and irresponsible characters and personalities and prima donnas and almost cult leaders in some levels, I try to hold myself to a set standard. And I have colleagues that are much more involved in looking at things from the point of view of UFOs and consciousness, and more esoteric ways of coming at it, which is completely legitimate. I happen to have been trained in investigative research and grounded by my mentors, who all really encouraged me, as they did, to do it in a rather plodding, earthbound manner, and build your cases on a triangulation of evidence, so to say, physical evidence, anecdotal evidence, credible, ideally multiply witnessed support, photographic analysis, and historic data, declassified documents, rather than I've never built any kind of casework on channeled messages from ancient aliens or, alleged deep sources within the intelligence community. I'm basically an independent operator and always have been, except for my associations with the mentors that helped me get to the point where I am. I vibrate at a relatively low frequency, some might say.
So moving on then, we spoke a bit about the case that you talked about in some of your presentations in the Soviet Union in 1989. I think it was a close encounter of the third kind.
Yes.
What was that about then?
Well, first, in the old Cold War days, UFO research community could only speculate on what was going on in what was then referred to as Iron Curtain countries, or post-revolutionary China. When everything came apart in 1989, 1990, and documentation started to be easier to get, what we saw was that the Soviets were dealing with the same questions that we in the West were dealing with, had the same concerns, and were coming up with some of the same dead ends we were. But right at that point where the Soviet Union was really about to come undone, a case broke in a city called Voronezh, although I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I think about 800 miles south, slightly due west of Moscow, where the most remarkable set of occurrences not only seemed to have transpired. What really was fascinating for me, not as some trained Sovietologist, but as an American primarily of Russian descent, who on my own visited the Soviet Union. This is not much more than a kid with a pack on my back, coming back from India and traveling through Afghanistan to Iran, taking a train to the Soviet border after doing all my paperwork at the embassy in Kabul, another time and another place.
What sort of year would this be, Peter?
Say again?
What sort of year was this, Peter?
Early 1970s.
Right.
And on my own, traveled through part of the Soviet Union, visited Moscow and then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg again. Anyway, what fascinated me as much as the particulars of the case was the fact that it was the first case and the last one, so to say, to be released, even though it was slightly after the fact. The events happened in later September of '89. The case broke in the Western world in early end of the first week, beginning of the second week of October of '89. And that it broke through Izvestia and Pravda, the official Soviet mouthpiece, news organizations, and that the government was the one saying this is real, as opposed to, this is more Western nonsense, to create a diversion. Also, the fact that the Soviets and the Americans for 45 years played something of a game of moving around the pieces, so to say, when a real UFO incident might threaten to be interpreted as, God forbid, an incoming intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile, or when, Soviet or American airspace was penetrated by spy craft like the U-2 or the SR-71, and they played that as part of the game of fusing what was really going on for us, the public. Anyway, it alleged that a craft came down in a public park in later afternoon as school was getting out, and was witnessed by many adults and many children. And it didn't fit into any classification of anything that we had really seen in the UFO research community. The craft allegedly came down and set in a large tree, and then a large being and a small robot being kind of came down the tree and moved around the park. At one point, a child screamed. The larger being produced what looked like, some kind of firearm, aimed it at the child, who disappeared, reappeared later, and that there were physiological changes to the soil, to the tree, and so on. And the first report that came out on American television was, that I was aware of, was on the fledgling then, I think, CNN News Network. And I had the TV on in the background. I was living on West 57th Street in Manhattan at the time, ironically working on a chapter that for the book that turned out to be Left at East Gate, and immediately put a video cassette in my video cassette player. If you're a young person, you might not know what that is, but
I know.
it's a bit like an LP, a long playing record, another technology. And I just started to record these accounts that were coming across American television. Within minutes, I thought, you know what? The headquarters of Pravda, Izvestia, are in Rockefeller Center, which is about, if you've never been there, you still know it because it's a famous landmark, maybe 20 minutes walk from where I lived. And I called them on the phone, just called them and put on my best grown-up voice and said, hello, I'm an investigative writer who specializes in the subject of UFOs, and I'm watching this story break right now. Is there anybody there that I could speak to about this Soviet UFO story that's breaking right now? And whoever was on the phone with me said, come down to the office. I thought, whoa. And I was there in probably a little over 20 minutes. And the next thing I know, I'm in the offices of the Soviet news agency, still in the Cold War, with all of these really rather excited and open Russian news people living and working in America, who were quite excited to have somebody in the office that knows about UFOs. And I hung out there for an hour or so, watching stuff come off of the telexes. They gave me original telexes before I left and wished me, good luck on my research and things. And then quite by chance, within a year or less, an editor I knew of a scientific publication that I subscribed to contacted me to say that she had received a copy of a book on the subject of this Voronozh UFO incident from a Russian UFO researcher, asking that he send her a copy of this scientific publication, which was rooted in the work of Dr. Wilhelm Reich, who I have been very involved in most of my life, one way or another. And she said, I think you need to make contact with this person and you should get the book. Well, it was in Russian, of course, but I had his mailing address and I wrote him. His name, Associate Professor Yuri Lizotsev, and we began to correspond. And that correspondence very quickly became a friendship. And a year earlier, I would have never encouraged him, and I certainly would not have probably done it myself, to write letters, send parcels back and forth, because of course they would be opened and looked at, and it might not be good for him. It certainly might not be good for me, but not as dangerous. But both of us felt that, they were busy with other things. And, the empire was crumbling. And meanwhile, we were exchanging hard data on Rendlesham and on this case, and ended up, really being quite good friends. But we never really were able to place the events of September 1989 in any category because they were so outrageous. What I was very interested in also was the American news organization's reaction to the case. They couldn't leave it alone. It was front page for a short duration in major American newspapers across the country, starting with the New York Times, that their usual habit of the lady doth protest too much, of throwing every kind of condescension and innuendo and, dismissal at the story, sometimes carrying 3 or 4 pieces a day for the first week or so after the event. And when one reporter, several days in, took the story very seriously, front page article, she disappeared. And the next day it was back to the mocking. And then Yuri was sending me copies of all of the Soviet news coverage, and it was all over the place in the Soviet Union. Again, this is at a moment where the government is breaking down. People are expressing, the news coverage was actually really extraordinary from what I understand from the translations that I was seeing. But the depictions were quite amazing. I mean, again, this large being, 8 or 9 feet tall, this small robot-like being, this disappearance and reappearance of a child. But because so many of the accounts were accounts of children, school was getting out, they were major witnesses. It was dismissed as, oh, they're just children. And, the fact that the Soviet press is now experiencing an unprecedented level of freedom, well, the Soviets, it's all the old Russian Orthodox mysticism coming up and superstition, the same kind of stuff that was usually accompanied coverage of major UFO events in South and Central America when it would reach the American, press establishment. Oh, they're these Catholic peasants, very insulting. And again, for a lot of the mindset of the time, okay, I can dismiss that. Woo. But I wrote about it extensively. I lectured on it. Again, I had contact with one of the lead researchers on location. And for anybody who is a Russian reader and interested in the subject, I can supply them with original first-generation analysis of the physiological material they were finding, incredible witness accounts, and like us, dismissive, cute political cartoons, flying saucers and aliens, little green men, haha. But yes, a very important case in UFO studies, and I guess kind of the Roswell of the Soviet Union, only because, like Rendlesham, it's the best known case in terms of the field of UFO studies that we have. So it assumes a proportion. There may be more dramatic cases that came out of that time, but many of them have not reached us in, Western UFO studies.
Mm.
It intrigues me that the Soviets would be so open about it, because I thought they would just keep
Yes,
everything hush hush. And why do you think that is? What game were they playing?
I think because it was real and because it was undeniable and because the government at that moment in time thought, what the hell? And again, it was released through Pravda and Izvestia, with the government seal of approval on it.
Hmm.
My first thoughts were, what's the catch here?
Yeah.
What is this, some kind of way to try to, spin something or, fool the West or whatever? But no, it was a unique event at a unique moment in time, at a unique moment in political and world history. And it was what it was. And it had the government's seal of approval. Again, the government then fell, and then it was every man for themselves and, the oligarchy that we now have under Putin.
Mm.
Mm. It reminds me, when you say about it came down and almost virtually landed on a tree, of the Flat Woods monster incident, where that was in the 50s, I think,
Yep.
where some creature from well, I wouldn't say crash, but it seemed to have landed in these woods just beyond this farmhouse. They ran up to where they thought this craft was, and someone spotted something up in the tree, and I think they described it like a robot or something. It had kind of pipe in around the lower section. I mean, the original artist that drew it for the TV program that they were featured on drew it as a dress, a woman's dress, but the lady who witnessed it described it like women's pleats or something, or curtains or something like that.
Once you're absolutely right, and once again, a parallel to Voronozh is that no other being or description or depiction matches anything else in the world of UFO studies. It's, it may make it easier for skeptics to dismiss, or just to say, there are human beings that really don't look like most other human beings. Organic evolution, or, quirks, or a race of, or a creation of, that doesn't match others is not necessarily cause for dismissal.
And I wonder what happened to the kid that was fired at with a ray gun and then came back. I mean, they must be
Well,
grown up now.
He definitely reappeared. We do have multiple confirmation of that, but we also have accounts from parents in the area who were very concerned about, the long-term impact, psychological impact on their kids,
Yeah.
and the fact that other craft were seen in the sky at about the same time or within a day or two, and the fact that civilian investigators went into that park within hours and were doing what good civilian investigators do. Lizotsev's specialty, as I recall, was he worked for a technical college, lack of better description, and his as an associate professor, his research specialty was in the area of stress in metal materials. But of course, as somebody who was trained in scientific methodology and aided by other serious UFO researchers, like here and in the UK, you do your best to establish what you can based on the information that the site gives you, like law enforcement personnel investigating, a criminal site that's been taped off and doing their best to analyze and collect materials.
Okay. Well, we're coming up to the end of the show here now, Peter. So thank you very much, first of all, for agreeing to take part. It's been absolutely fascinating discussion. Goes into all sorts of areas one doesn't even think that it might do, but that's the great thing about it.
Well, listen, Neil and Andrew, you've been absolutely terrific in terms of your professionality and asking such interesting questions. I'd be glad to return as a guest.
Be
And I don't
fantastic.
say
Mm.
that a lot because I do a lot of interviews, and some of them I'm happy to finish up and go on to other ones.
Some not.
I would like to say before we separate, though, I will be returning to the UK to speak at a conference that's been pushed back for second year now. It will be in Hull in May. It's the Outer Limits UFO Conference, and it's a wonderful lineup of presenters. Some of my favorite colleagues in the UK will be speaking there. I am so looking forward to this. I have visited the UK several dozen times, certainly more than a zillion Americans. I have so many friends there. It's the longest I've gone without being in the United Kingdom in one location or another since the late 1980s. And I am really looking forward to getting back. So you can go online on either just find the Outer Limits magazine website or their Facebook page and consider registering and joining me at this conference. So many of us are looking forward to getting back in the game for live events and, not another Zoom talk or what have you.
Mm,
Not that
mm.
they're bad or anything, but it's going to be a great conference. Also, I would love it if some of your viewers and listeners start to join me once a week for my radio show. It's at an absolutely outrageous time for most sane working people. UK time, it's midnight to 2 a.m. But if you become a subscriber to the show, and I get $1 per month for every subscriber I have. So this is not exactly, rubbing my hands together because this is making me a fortune. But I'm very proud of the show I'm doing. I've been doing it since late December. Broadcasting has become my central way of working right now after more than 40 years of every other way. I've set it up so that I hope that everybody that listens to every show like this will listen and watch mine. But it's also a show that is built on catering to people who have never watched or listened to a UFO related broadcast. And I welcome those viewers especially. The name of the show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. And if you go to the radio station website, which is KGRADB, as in digital broadcasting, KGRADB.com, and scroll down to the bottom of the page and subscribe either by the month or the year. For example, if you use, you get a 30% discount if you use my first name as your password when you subscribe, which in US dollars brings it down to about $4.50 a month. And for that, you not only get to listen to my broadcasts anytime you want, and most of them are very visual. Most of my guests supply me with a great deal of illustrations, and they are among the best known and most respected and up and coming people in the field and in the paranormal as well. Although I veer off into the arts as well, have film directors and writers and authors, experiencers, abductees, etc. That you also have access to KGRA's, which is a American radio network specializing in UFO and paranormal broadcasts and shows, literally thousands of them that you will have access to, and just add to what you're learning and enjoying in your terrific show. Again, Meanwhile Here on Earth. And if you want to check it out at no cost, you can get a 3-day free membership, or just go to YouTube and type in Meanwhile Here on Earth and watch a number of the shows live. The way it's set up now, even if you stay up into those wee hours, you can only watch the first half hour without being a subscriber, but you can listen live when it's broadcast at no cost by going to kgradb.com and listening live at that website. And thank you for allowing me this shameless mercenary plug.
We would ask you anyway to plug it. So that's
Yeah.
what we always traditionally ask our guests, plug away, because that's you know, we love to find out what people are doing. So very best of luck with your show. I have listened to a little bits of it, and I know you did interview Ronnie and Philip Kinsella, friends of ours, and they will be joining you at the Outer Limits conference in Hull next
will.
year. So we wish you well with that. I'm certainly looking forward and trying to get up there myself. Maybe
Great.
Andy, we can go up there and do a recce together.
I
Even
hope
go
you do.
around
It'd
with
be
our little
wonderful.
microphones and grab people and sort of.
Totally. And imbibe in some alcoholic beverages as well.
Absolutely, that would be the well. That's the only reason I go to these things. But
What's the date of the conference, Peter? Do you know the date?
I think it's the 20th to the 22nd, but I refer everybody, I don't remember off the top of my head, go to outerlimitsmagazine.com or their Facebook page, and the information will come up. It's not too early to reserve. It will be a spectacular weekend, and not just the presentations, but just contact with people who are like-minded and get to meet all the presenters. The authors will be there again, Ronnie and Philip. So many terrific friends and colleagues in the UK. I'm looking forward to it tremendously.
Excellent.
Hope to meet a lot of you when we're there.
And that's being run and organised by Chris Evers, who also has his own show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. He was with Philip Mantle doing their show. I understand that Philip Mantle's now not doing the show with him anymore, but Chris Evers is bringing out his new show, and I can't remember the title, but we wish Chris well with that, but also wish him well with the conference. So thank you very much once again, Peter, and thank you to Andy for joining us as well. And you've been listening and watching the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Stay tuned for future shows and also other shows that are coming up on the network. Scroll down through the many myriad of programs we have on our Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm sure there's a lot for everybody, but also tune in to Peter on his Meanwhile Back on Earth show, because that sounds really good. And I'm certainly want to take a few more checkouts of that show as well. Okay, thank you very much indeed, one and all, and we'll see you next month. Good night.
Nanu, nanu.